Why early explorers carried nothing useful and, well, lived longer because of it. One of the strangest realizations you come to when studying early exploration is this. By modern standards, many of history's most successful explorers carried almost nothing that today would be considered useful. No multi-tools packed with features, no redundant gadgets, no specialized equipment for every imagined scenario. And yet, these people routinely survived journeys that killed later, better-equipped expeditions. That isn't coincidence, it's a clue, and it points to a survival logic that runs completely counter to modern thinking. Early explorers didn't survive because they were tougher or luckier. They survived because they understood a principle we've largely forgotten. Usefulness is contextual, and excess usefulness can be deadly. The paradox is simple. The more useful gear you carry, the more it changes how you move, how you decide, and how you fail. Early explorers carried less not because they were primitive, but because they understood the cost of carrying the wrong kind of usefulness. Why useful gear creates invisible risk. Modern survival culture treats usefulness as an absolute. If a tool can do something, it belongs in the kit. Early explorers thought differently. They judged gear by whether it preserved mobility, adaptability, and decision-making under stress. Every item carried imposed a tax. Weight slowed movement, bulk limited route choices, complexity increased failure points, specialized tools locked the user into specific solutions. This is why many early explorers favored simple blades over complex tools, containers over mechanisms, and materials that could be repurposed rather than devices designed for one task. They weren't under-equipped, they were deliberately uncommitted. They carried objects, not answers. So, how did minimalism actually extend life expectancy out on the trail? Well, if you look closely at expedition failure reports from the 18th and 19th centuries, you'll start to notice a pattern. The most heavily equipped expeditions, oddly enough, were usually the first to fail. They moved slower, they burned through more resources, and they depended on established routes and predictable conditions. But when weather, terrain, or politics disrupted those assumptions, the whole expedition just sort of collapsed under its own weight. Explorers who carried less, well, they managed to keep their freedom. They could change routes on the fly, abandon plans if needed, split up into smaller groups, or even integrate with local populations. Mobility in these situations really did extend life. On the other hand, rigidity, being tied down by too much gear, almost always shortened it. Early Arctic travelers really are a perfect example of this. European expeditions, often loaded up with all sorts of useful technology, things like metal stoves, canned food, and heavy tents, ended up suffering catastrophic losses. Meanwhile, indigenous travelers with minimal gear kept moving, adapted their shelter to whatever conditions they faced, and adjusted their travels based on the weather and animal behavior. The real difference wasn't just knowledge, It was what their gear actually allowed them to do. There's a sort of hidden advantage, in carrying nothing specialized. See, specialized gear, it tends to solve problems only in ideal conditions. Early explorers, well, they assumed that conditions would never actually be ideal. So rather than carrying tools designed for just one specific task, they brought along materials and skills that could honestly serve loads of different roles. Rope, for example, wasn't just rope. It could be shelter, repair material, restraint, a navigation aid, or even a kind of insurance. Cloth wasn't just for clothing. It doubled as a bandage, a filter, insulation, a signal, or even a trade good. And fire-starting materials, those weren't just backup systems. They were absolutely central survival infrastructure. This whole approach meant fewer items, but, well, much deeper utility. Nothing was really single-purpose. Nothing needed ideal conditions to work. So When a tool broke, it wasn't the end of the world. If a plan failed, it didn't just spiral into disaster. Now, why did explorers avoid so-called comfort gear? One of the most surprising things, honestly, about early exploration is just how little comfort gear they actually carried. And it wasn't some act of stoicism, it was in fact strategy. Comfort gear, you see, encourages dependency. When warmth, shelter or food gets externalized into equipment, decision-making starts to shift. People push farther, go later and work harder simply because the gear promises protection. But when that promise breaks, exposure is, well, immediate and severe. So, early explorers, well, they built comfort from process, not equipment. They stopped early, and they chose camps quite deliberately. They layered their clothing manually, and importantly, they regulated their effort to control sweat and fatigue. Because comfort wasn't guaranteed by gear, it was managed constantly. This actually reduced catastrophic failure. There's the psychological advantage of carrying less. Honestly, there's a mental component that modern discussions often miss. Carrying less reduces cognitive load. Fewer items mean, well, fewer decisions, fewer checks, and fewer dependencies. Under stress, this really matters. Explorers who traveled light reported greater situational awareness. They noticed terrain changes, weather shifts, and animal signs earlier. And they reacted faster because they weren't mentally anchored to equipment solutions. When survival depended on judgment rather than tools, judgment stayed sharp. This is one reason why explorers who adopted indigenous travel methods often outlived those who clung to imported gear. The shift wasn't just practical, it was psychological. What modern survival advice gets wrong by adding more gear? Today's survival culture often confuses preparedness with accumulation. The assumption is that more capability equals more safety. History suggests the opposite once a certain threshold is crossed. Gear that replaces skill atrophies judgment. Gear that promises rescue delays decision-making. Gear that adds weight reduces options. None of this shows up in marketing brochures, but it shows up clearly in survival outcomes. Early explorers survived because their gear never replaced thinking. It supported it. So how do you actually apply this lesson without, romanticizing hardship? This isn't an argument for deprivation. Really, it's an argument for restraint. Ask of every item, not just what does it do, but what does it make me rely on? Does it lock you into certain conditions? Does it perhaps encourage unnecessary risk-taking? And does it reduce your ability to adapt if it fails? Carry items that expand your options, not ones that narrow them. It's worth favoring materials over mechanisms, processes over devices, and honestly, skills over redundancy. Early explorers didn't live longer because they carried nothing. They lived longer because they carried only what didn't trap them. That lesson is just as relevant now as it was centuries ago. If you value this kind of historically grounded survival thinking, do consider subscribing to the channel. Share this with someone who believes preparedness is simply about buying more gear, and help keep these lessons alive. History isn't minimalist for nostalgia's sake. It's minimalist because, quite simply, minimalism kept people alive.